The gavel came down at 9:14 a.m. on a frozen Tuesday morning, March 3, 1992, on the courthouse steps of Caldwell County, Iowa. Frost clung to the grass. A crowd of 31 people stood in wool coats, breath fogging in the air, watching an auctioneer named Russ Bowden read out a case number instead of a name. Case number 92 CV 417. Delman Farm Credit Bank versus the estate of Walter Ashford. Standing at the edge of that crowd, in a coat 2 sizes too big for her because it used to belong to her father, was a 17-year-old girl named Ruth Ashford. She was not crying. She had cried out the tears 3 nights earlier in the hayloft alone, after the sheriff's department taped a foreclosure notice to the front door of the only home she'd ever known. 320 acres, 4 generations, gone in 11 minutes. The man who bought it for 41 cents on the dollar was a broad-shouldered banker in a camel hair coat named Preston Calloway, senior vice president of Delman Farm Credit Bank. He didn't even get out of his car until the auction was over. When he finally did, he walked past Ruth without looking at her, phone pressed to his ear, and said the line that would live in her chest for the next 3 decades. "Told you people, land doesn't care about your name on the deed, it cares who holds the paper." Ruth Ashford was left standing on gravel that used to be her driveway, holding a cardboard box with her father's leather journal, a rusted key, and $11 in cash. She had no idea in that moment that the key in her hand would one day unlock the very fortune that destroyed her family. This is the story of how she got it all back, and then some. The Ashford farm sat on Route 9 outside the town of Millbrook, Iowa, since 1919, when Ruth's great-grandfather Elias Ashford cleared the first 20 acres with a mule named Hercules, and a debt of $600 he paid off in 11 years. By the time Ruth was born in 1975, the farm had grown to 320 acres of corn, soybeans, and a modest dairy operation, 42 Holsteins, a barn built in 1954, and a farmhouse with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Her father, Walter Ashford, was a quiet man who believed a handshake meant more than a signature. Her mother, Colleen, kept the books in a spiral notebook and canned tomatoes every August. Ruth grew up waking at 5:00 a.m. to help with the milking before school, and she loved the land the way some people love a person, completely, and without needing a reason. The trouble started in the summer of 1988, when a drought cut Iowa corn yields by nearly 40%. Walter took out an operating loan of $84,000 from Delman Farm Credit Bank to cover seed, feed, and equipment repair, signing papers across a mahogany desk from a young loan officer eager to climb the ladder, Preston Calloway, then 29 years old, sharp-suited and hungry. "This is a standard variable rate note, Mr. Ashford," Calloway said, sliding the paper across. "Nothing to worry about. The bank believes in family farms." Walter believed him. He didn't have a lawyer read the fine print on the balloon clause buried on page 14, a clause that allowed the bank to call the full remaining balance due after 36 months if the prime rate crossed a certain threshold. It did. In late 1991, interest rates spiked, and Delman Farm Credit Bank, now with Calloway freshly promoted to senior vice president, called the note. Full balance due $91,200 payable within 90 days. Walter tried everything. He sold 16 head of cattle. He mortgaged the equipment. He begged for a restructuring meeting, which Calloway granted, then denied in writing 2 weeks later, citing portfolio risk standards, in a letter that took less than 4 minutes to write and destroyed 100 years of family history. On February 9, 1992, Walter Ashford suffered a heart attack in the barn 3 weeks before the auction was set to proceed. He survived barely but was in Caldwell Memorial Hospital, unable to speak clearly when the auction date arrived. Colleen Ashford stayed at his bedside. It was Ruth, 17 years old, who stood on the courthouse steps alone and watched Preston Calloway's bank take everything for $131,000. The farm, the equipment, and the herd, a fraction of what her father always said it was worth. She remembered one more thing from that morning. As Calloway signed the final transfer documents, he glanced at her and said, almost as an afterthought, "Nothing personal, sweetheart, it's just business." She was going to make it very personal. The Ashfords moved into a rented 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on Grant Street in Millbrook. Walter never fully recovered his speech. Colleen took a job at the school cafeteria. Ruth dropped out of her senior year extracurriculars to work nights stocking shelves at a grocery store for $4.35 an hour, finishing her diploma through night classes. For 3 years, Ruth carried a quiet fury she told no one about. She watched Preston Calloway's career soar. He became bank president by 1996, drove a new Cadillac, and was profiled in the Caldwell County Gazette as the man rebuilding rural credit in Iowa. Every time she passed his photo in the paper, something in her chest tightened like a fist. In the fall of 1994, cleaning out a storage unit the family still rented, Ruth found her father's old leather-field journal, the same one she'd grabbed from the farmhouse the day of the auction. Most of it was mundane: planting schedules, rainfall notes, feed costs. But tucked into the back pages, dated across 1979 to 1985, were detailed notes on something her father had experimented with quietly for years. A rotational grazing and soil regeneration method he'd developed himself, combining old techniques passed down from Ruth Ashford with newer ideas he'd read about in agricultural journals. Walter called it, in his own handwriting, the resting field system. He'd tested it on a 5-acre plot behind the barn and recorded soil quality nearly triple that of the county average, using almost no chemical fertilizer. Nobody had ever known. Walter was too proud, too private, and too busy simply keeping the farm alive to ever turn it into anything. Ruth read that journal until 2 a.m. 7 nights in a row. In the margins, she started writing her own notes. This wasn't nostalgia, it was a blueprint. "I don't have land," she told her mother one night, spreading the journal open on their small kitchen table. "But I have this, and someday I'm going to need it." In 1996, at 21, Ruth Ashford had saved $2,300 from 3 years of double shifts. It wasn't enough for land, but it was enough for a used shipping container, some lumber, wiring, and a stack of grow lights, enough to convert half of the family's rented garage into a controlled indoor growing space. She wasn't growing corn. Iowa didn't need another corn farmer. Instead, she used her father's soil regeneration notes to build a compact, high-density microgreens and specialty herb operation. Basil, arugula, pea shoots, wheatgrass, crops that grew fast, sold high, and needed almost no land at all. She researched everything at the Millbrook Public Library, borrowing books on hydroponics and horticulture, teaching herself nutrient cycles and pH balancing by trial and error, ruining 3 batches before she got one right. Her first sale was on May 14, 1996, 6 pounds of pea shoots to a restaurant in Cedar Rapids called the Millhouse for $54. The chef, a woman named Denise Acre, tasted them and called back the next morning. "Where did you learn to grow like this?" Denise asked. "My father," Ruth said, "sort of, he never got to finish." By the end of that first year, Ruth was supplying 5 restaurants and had hired her first part-time helper, her mother, on weekends. Revenue for 1996, $11,400. It wasn't a fortune. But for the first time since the auction, Ruth Ashford wasn't just surviving, she was building. She named the small operation Ashford Field Company after the field notes that started it all. By 2001, Ashford Field Company had grown into a modest but respected regional supplier, leasing a small commercial building outside Millbrook and employing 6 people. Revenue crossed $310,000 that year. Ruth, now 26, had built something entirely her own, without a single dollar of debt from Delman Farm Credit Bank, a fact she was fiercely proud of. That was the year Preston Calloway, now bank president and a rising figure in the Iowa Bankers Association, noticed her name on a regional emerging agribusiness list published in a trade magazine. He remembered the name Ashford instantly. At a Chamber of Commerce mixer in October 2001, Calloway approached her directly, drink in hand, smiling the same cold smile she remembered from the courthouse steps 9 years earlier. "Ashford Field Company," he said, reading her name badge. "Any relation to Walter Ashford out on Old Route 9? "His daughter," Ruth said evenly. Calloway's smile flickered just slightly. "Small world, you've done well for yourself. Didn't figure that family had it in them." "We had it," Ruth said. "We just never had a fair shot at using it." Calloway laughed it off, but the comment stuck with him. Within 2 months, Ashford Field Company's landlord, coincidentally a customer of Delman Farm Credit Bank with an outstanding commercial loan, informed Ruth he would not be renewing her lease, citing a change in building plans. She later learned, through a sympathetic loan officer named Grace Whitfield who quietly reached out to warn her, that Calloway had personally called the landlord and mentioned, in passing, that the bank would look favorably on a renovation loan if the space were freed up. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even provable, not yet. But it was a message: I can still take things from you. Ruth had 6 weeks to find a new location or lose everything she'd built. Instead of panicking, Ruth did something Calloway never expected. She drove to the county assessor's office and pulled every public foreclosure and land record from 1990 to 1995. She wanted to understand exactly how many families Delman Farm Credit Bank had processed through auctions like her father's, and whether the pattern of aggressive balloon clause loans and rapid loan calls was isolated to the Ashfords or something larger. What she found stunned her. Between 1990 and 1994, Delman Farm Credit Bank had foreclosed on 19 family farms in Caldwell and 2 neighboring counties, nearly all of them carrying the same obscure balloon rate clause buried deep in standard loan documents. A clause the bank had quietly stopped using after 1995. Once state regulators began scrutinizing rural lending practices following a wave of farm bankruptcies. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't yet know what to do with the information. But she photocopied every document she could legally access and started a folder she labeled simply 9192. With the clock ticking on her lease, Ruth made a bold move. She approached a small independent regional lender, Prairie Trust Bank, 40 miles away in Ellery, run by a no-nonsense woman named Marion Doyle who had built her career specifically competing against bigger banks like Delman. Ruth brought her full financials, 3 years of clean growth, purchase orders from 14 restaurants, and her father's original field journal as, in her words, proof of concept. "You're not asking me for hope," Marion said, flipping through the numbers. "You're showing me math." On December 2, 2001, Prairie Trust Bank approved Ruth a $180,000 small business loan. At a fixed rate, with no balloon clause, something Ruth insisted on reading twice out loud before signing. She used it to purchase outright a 4-acre plot with an old barn 11 miles from her original family land. Land she quietly, almost symbolically, chose because a county surveyor once told her its soil composition closely matched the Ashford farm's original 5-acre test plot. She converted the barn into a climate-controlled vertical growing facility, scaled up production, and by 2004 was supplying grocery chains across 3 states under a wholesale contract worth $1.2 million annually. She called this new, larger property Ashford Fields, and made a private vow that one day, the name would return to the original 320 acres. In 2007, Ruth crossed paths with someone who would change the trajectory of everything. A retired agricultural loan examiner named Harold Weiss, who had spent 22 years at the Iowa Farm Credit Administration before retiring in 1998. Ruth met him at a rural finance workshop where she was invited to speak about her growth story. After her talk, Harold approached her. "Ashford," he said, "I remember that name. I flagged your father's loan file back in '91 before I got overruled." Ruth froze. "Flagged it for what?" "The balloon clause," Harold said quietly. "Delman wasn't supposed to be issuing that clause to family farm operating loans under $100,000. It violated an internal risk policy the bank itself had on file, meant to protect small borrowers. I wrote it up. Got told to drop it. 6 months later, I watched 19 files come through with the same clause, all called within the same 18-month window, right as interest rates spiked and land values were at a low point. It looked less like bad luck and more like a strategy: call the loans while rates are high, buy the land while it's cheap." He still had copies. He'd kept them in a storage unit in Ellery for 16 years, unsure what to do with paperwork nobody asked to see. Ruth spent the next 18 months working with Harold and a young rural finance attorney named Devin Marsh, building a case, not just for her father, but gathering sworn statements from 4 other displaced families who were willing to come forward, once they saw Ruth wasn't afraid to lead. Devin discovered something even more damning: internal bank memos, obtained through a public records request tied to a 1996 state banking review, showing Callaway himself had personally recommended accelerating loan calls on 9 specific properties in early 1992, including, by name, W. Ashford RT. 9, in a memo that used the phrase prime acquisition opportunity, post-auction value estimated to 5x purchase. He hadn't just enforced a bad clause. He targeted her father's farm specifically for its resale value and rushed the foreclosure while Walter was in the hospital. "This isn't a lending mistake," Devin told her, laying the memo on the table. "This is fraud on the borrowers and a breach of fiduciary duty. And it's 20 years old, but Iowa's discovery rule means the clock may not have started running until you found this memo." Ruth looked at the paper for a long time, then she looked up. "Then let's make sure everyone sees it. The case, Ashford et al. v. Delman Farm Credit Bank, was filed in Caldwell County District Court in March 2009, 17 years, almost to the day, after the original auction. It combined Ruth's claim with 3 other displaced farm families Devin Marsh had located, all willing to testify. The hearing that mattered most took place on the morning of September 18, 2009, in the very same courthouse building where Ruth had stood as a 17-year-old girl holding a cardboard box. Preston Callaway, now 60 years old and still bank president, arrived in a tailored suit, visibly irritated at being summoned over what his own attorney called dismissively ancient history. Ruth sat at the plaintiff's table, calm, dressed simply, her father's original field journal placed beside her legal folder not as evidence, but as a reminder of why she was there. Devin Marsh presented the internal memo first, projected onto a screen for the courtroom. "Mr. Callaway," Devin said, "can you explain why in a February 1992 internal memo, you personally recommended accelerating the loan call on the Ashford property, while Walter Ashford was hospitalized following a heart attack, and specifically noted its resale value at 2.5 times the purchase price?" Callaway's composure cracked for the first time. "That's an old projection document. It doesn't prove intent." "Then perhaps you can explain," Devin continued, "why Mr. Weiss's internal compliance flag on the same clause filed 4 months earlier was overruled by you the same week you were promoted to senior vice president. Calloway looked toward his own lawyer, who offered nothing. The courtroom was silent except for the low hum of the ceiling fans. Ruth was called to the stand next. She spoke plainly, without theatrics, describing the morning of the auction, her father in the hospital, the cardboard box, the $11. Then she looked directly at Calloway for the first time in 17 years. "You told me it was just business," Ruth said, her voice steady. "But I found the memo, Mr. Calloway. You didn't just call alone. You picked my father's farm because you already knew what it was worth to you. That's not business, that's theft with paperwork." The room stayed silent for a long moment. Calloway said nothing. For the first time in his career, he had no line ready. The case settled in December 2009, 6 weeks before it would have gone to a full jury trial. After Delman Farm Credit Bank's board, facing the memo's public exposure and a parallel inquiry, the Iowa Division of Banking opened once Harold Weiss's original 1991 compliance flag surfaced, moved quickly to limit the damage. The settlement terms, made part of the public court record, $2.4 million distributed among the 4 affected families based on documented losses, a formal written admission of wrongful loan practices between 1990 and 1994. And critically for Ruth, the right of first refusal to repurchase the original 320-acre Ashford property, which the bank had held in a long-term land trust after failing to resell it profitably during the 2008 agricultural downturn. Preston Calloway resigned from Delman Farm Credit Bank on January 6, 2010, 4 days before the bank's board would have voted to remove him. The Iowa Division of Banking barred him from holding a fiduciary lending role in the state for 8 years. His name, once printed proudly in the Caldwell County Gazette, now appeared beside the headline, "Bank President Resigns Amid Foreclosure Fraud Allegations." Ruth used a portion of her settlement, combined with 9 years of Ashford Field's profits, to formally repurchase the original 320 acres on Route 9 on April 4, 2010, 18 years and 1 month after the auction that took it. She stood on the same gravel driveway, now cracked and overgrown, and had the barn rebuilt from the original 1954 foundation. She didn't return to traditional row crop farming. Instead, she merged the original land with everything she'd built, expanding Ashford Fields into a full regenerative agriculture operation combining her father's soil resting method, modern vertical growing technology, and a working demonstration farm that by 2015 was valued at over $6.2 million and supplied produce to markets across 6 states. She hired Harold Weiss as a consultant. She funded a small scholarship at the local community college for children of families who'd lost farms to foreclosure, named simply the Walter Ashford Fund. And every spring, she opened 5 acres of the property, the same 5 acres her father once quietly tested his soil resting system on, 60 years earlier, for free workshops teaching young farmers the very techniques that had once been dismissed as a struggling man's private hobby. Walter Ashford, whose speech never fully returned after his heart attack, was there the day the new barn's ribbon was cut in 2011, sitting in a wheelchair on the porch that once again wrapped around 3 sides of a rebuilt farmhouse. Ruth knelt beside him and placed the old leather field journal in his hands. "We're back, Dad," she said, "and we're bigger than they ever let us be." He couldn't say much, but he smiled and he held the journal against his chest like it was the deed itself. Preston Calloway once told a 17-year-old girl that land doesn't care about your name, it only cares who holds the paper. He was wrong. Land remembers who tends it, and people remember who tries to bury them. Ruth Ashford didn't win because she got lucky. She won because she read every page of a forgotten journal when everyone else would have thrown it away. She won because she worked double shifts and grew pea shoots in a garage instead of waiting for someone to hand her a second chance. She won because when the system tried to erase her family twice, she kept records, kept receipts, and kept her composure and let the truth do the rest. If you're watching this today because something was taken from you, a business, a home, a piece of your family's history, your dignity, know this. The people who take things from you are usually counting on you staying quiet. They are counting on you believing it's over. It's not over until you decide it is. Keep your documents, keep your journal. Keep building quietly, patiently, relentlessly, even in a garage, even from nothing. Because somewhere down the line, the very thing they threw away might be exactly what buries them. This has been a story about loss, patience, and the long, quiet road back to justice. If it moved you, remember, the comeback is always bigger than the setback, you just have to survive long enough to build it.